Now that we understand how the Boolean tool works, let's try shattering this rock further to prepare it for destruction. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to center this piece of rock to the grid. So I will add a transform node. And here's a handy trick. I will type in all three axes minus $CEX, which is the value of the centroid of the object. Then for the y-axis, I will type minus $CEY. Same for the z-axis. I'll type minus $CEZ and enter. Now, notice how the rock is centered on the grid, and this will make my explanation much easier. This step is not mandatory, but I think it will help us in this case. So first of all, I will create a grid, and I'm going to use this grid object to cut through the rock. Now let's template the rock, select the grid, and make the grid a bit larger, say 30 meters. Let's also increase its subdivisions. Let's try with 40 and 40. And I'm going to add some noise. I can use a mountain node just to make it a little more irregular. I will increase the height and probably increase the size as well. Something like this is fine. Now remember in our earlier chapter how the Boolean sub will create new geometry and will inherit the UVs from the objects we're using to create the Boolean. So before we go much further, I will add a UV texture node and create an orthographic projection along the y-axis. So the defaults are fine. If you want to check the UVs that we just generated, you can go to the perspective and press spacebar 5. And here we have our UVs. So I will now press spacebar 1 to go back to the perspective view. And I'm going to transform the grid so it goes through the rock in a more vertical way. So I'll press enter and I will rotate it a bit. I think something like this is fine. I will cut it in half. And now I'll go back to my rock object and add a Boolean node. And I will connect the grid to the second input of the Boolean. Now remember, by default, this node assumes that we have two solids and that we want an intersection of both. So in this case, my first input, or set A, is a solid, so this is fine. But my second input, which is set B, is not a solid object. In this case, we need to treat this object as a surface. Now, the second thing that I have to do is change the operation to intersect. Sorry, to shatter. So apparently nothing has happened, although we see here a green line. The model seems just the same as before. So let's try adding an exploded view just to see what happens. So now you will notice that we have the two pieces of rock and they were cut exactly where the plane is. And even we have some interior detail from the mountain sub that we used on the plane. And there's something very important that I usually do, especially when I'm doing destruction. And this I also explained in the previous chapter, but it's very important, so I will repeat it here. I will select my Boolean node, scroll down to where the group properties are, and make sure to tick B inside A. So this will create a group of the new faces that were created where the plane was intersecting the rock. And as we did before, I'm going to add a blast node just to show you which is the group that we just created. So select B inside A and delete non-selected. And actually, I'm going to connect it here below the exploded view. So here are the new faces. These are the exterior faces that existed before the Boolean. So we will be using the B inside A group, for example, to add normals back to the faces, or again to change the UVs, probably change the material. So let's go back to my Boolean node. And next, I want to show you a very interesting technique. I will go back to my plane object, make sure to click on it. And before I pipe it into the Boolean, I'm going to duplicate this plane. I'm going to add a transform. And actually, I will do this just before the vertical transformation I added. So I'm going to move it upward just a bit and merge it with my original plane. So you can press Y and drag on a connection just to break it. And I will again merge the original plane with a new transformed plane. So right now there's nothing interesting, they're just parallel one to each other. But what I want to do is to change the noise values or the mountain values that I added. So actually I'm going to also duplicate the mountain before I merge them together. And each plane will have its own height and offset. So let's increase a bit the height for this one. And let's offset in Y. Probably translate it less. Let's try it with 0.3. Probably 0.4. And you will notice how these two planes start to intersect. So I'll press spacebar W to go into wireframe. And you will notice how some of the parts from the bottom plane are intersecting over the top plane. And this will create some interesting effects once we've booleaned the rock. So let's try decreasing the element size a bit. Let's try with 1.5. And probably I will also decrease the height. So you can select both nodes at the same time to change one value for both of them. So let's try also decreasing the size and the height. Just make sure they keep intersecting. So again, let's lower the distance to 0.2. Now I will connect it back to the original transform. And let's see how the Boolean looks. So notice how we now have some interior pieces, not only the two halves. We have also some small pieces and some medium pieces, which will give a very interesting look to the destruction. So probably we don't want this huge middle piece. I'm going to try to break it up. But in general, what I'm looking for is small pieces and medium pieces that will give much more detail to my destruction. So just to avoid this very large piece, I'm going to increase the mountain height and see if we can break it up a little bit more. So probably I went too far. I'll bring it back to 3. And try reducing the transform height instead. So here it's just a matter of testing your values. So I think I will leave this up to you, but in general, what we're looking for is this breakup. Okay, I'm back after pausing the video for a few minutes. I kept testing a bit with the mountain parameters, and in the end I decided to create 2 more copies, and this did the trick. So now I have much more separated pieces, and if you check the exploded view, you'll notice how we don't have like these large pieces connected together. So I will go with this, and before we move ahead, I will show you a very nice trick with these intersected planes.